So the topic of this morning is Kipling, which is not a verb. Rudyard Kipling, some think is the wittiest, most timeless genius that the Raj produced. Others think he's anachronistic and has should be discredited for his nationalism. Who's right? How do we read this favorite who's left behind some of our most beloved and controversial books? So these three authors have written extensively on Kipling, even biographies of him, and they will be led by Swapan Dasgupta. And Swapan, as many people know, tends to favor unpopular and quirky causes. He's written on the deregulated economy, he's written on Curzonian foreign policy, he's done a narrative history of on Raj nostalgia, in England that no longer exists. So how do we describe this man? The right thinks he's on the left regard him as a friendly oddity who's a heretical nationalist. So Swapan, over to you.
Yeah. Good morning, everyone. I think it's a delicious irony that we should be celebrating the 66th Republic Day by commemorating Rudyard Kipling. The latest buzzword these days in India is the term inclusive. We seem to be inclusive about everything. We're politically inclusive, we are economically inclusive, in terms of religion we deem to be inclusive. I sometimes get the impression that India is a vast blotting paper. And when it comes to Nobel Prizes, I think we are very, very inclusive. We do celebrate those who are Indians, but even those whose connections with India are somewhat tenuous, whose great-grandfathers may have somehow touched India, Sir Vidya being one noted example. But somehow we seem to have forgotten another gentleman who did win the Nobel Prize in 1907, largely for his works on India, a man who for the first time put India on the map of world literature. It's not that literature didn't exist in India, but he put India on a global map. And I'm talking about Rudyard Kipling, a man who remains as contentious. Charles Allen in his book talks of him as the laureate of the empire, and others have fantasized about him being a crude caricature of Pakka Saab, probably with a riding crop in his hand. But at the same time, there have been people, and not least one of my favorite authors, Nirad Chaudhuri, who wrote about him as the man who actually chronicled a timeless India. So India is very central to Kipling. And I think to start off with, I'll go to Charles, who's written a book only about Kipling in India. And Charles, so which Kipling are we celebrating?
I think you're bang to rights there. Kipling famously or infamously described himself as Allah having given him two sides to his head. And for me, there's very much, there are these two Kiplings. There's Ruddy Kipling, as he and his parents called himself Ruddy, which of course has implications of bloody, as well as Rudyard. There's the young Kipling and there's the old Kipling. And for me, and I know my colleagues will disagree, I'm looking at the three of us here and I can't help thinking, are we the three wise monkeys, or are we, as Edward Said described us, are we dead white men in periwigs? Looking at the three of us here. Nevertheless, to get back to the point, the young Ruddy I find very attractive. He is a child of India. He has his first 5.5 years here, and he learns to be loved by Indians and to love those Indians who are closest to him, perhaps even closer than his parents. He also realizes, even as a little boy, that he is actually an outsider. His parents who come here think they're going to benefit from the British Raj. In fact, they find themselves very much down in the lower end of the social pile. He disguises that later on in his autobiography, but he's an outsider even when he starts, and he identifies very strongly with the outsider within India. So when he comes back here as a teenager, and I stress as a teenager, he's 16 years old, he thinks he's going to be a poet in London. And his headmaster summons him in the spring term and says, your father's found a job for you in India. And he's furious. Again, he disguises it in his autobiography. But we know he did not want to go back to India. He wanted to be a poet in London. So he's dumped in India, and he's a very sulky teenager. Those of you who've got teen parents will know exactly what I'm talking about. He's a very rude young boy, and he cheeks members of the club. He sees himself as a lost soul out there, and he's very, very rude about Indians. He hates India. He hates Indians. And then he makes this most extraordinary discovery, which he does in secret. There's a secret Kipling, which only emerges when his parents go away. He's living with his parents, and some of you, as teenagers, if you had to live with your parents, you know what a hell it is on earth. So Ruddy waits until the summer. His parents go to the hills, and Ruddy begins his night walks, his famous night walks. He's in Lahore, and he breaks away from the closed world of British India in what you might call the civil lines, and he walks through the night into fetid, hot, burning, sleeping Lahore. And we now know, thanks to the work that Andrew did and others, he goes to the brothels. He makes his contact with India through Indian women. And from that point onwards, his sympathy for Indian women is enormous. And it is, when you think about the two surrogate mothers in his two greatest books, Mowgli and Kim, you think it's the women, the Indian women, you may call her Balu, whatever it is, but there are these surrogate mothers who look after him. That's something, that is Mother India. We'll come past later, I won't talk too much, but so I have enormous sympathy for this young man who's growing up in a country that, to begin with, he hates. And then he comes back and he writes and he says to his cousin in England, I am in love with India. I love the dirt and the smells. And before that he's saying, Indians are not to be trusted. Indians are liars, they're deceitful, there's nothing here of value to me. And after that he has discovered India and he says, I have found my job in life. And he says, I'm like a cock crowing on a dunghill. And from that moment he begins to write wonderful poetry and wonderful stories.
I was just wondering, when you say Kipling disliked India, I think it would be fair to say Kipling disliked Bengalis.
But he didn't know Bengali.
He didn't know Bengalis. But Kipling also romanticized the frontier. I think there was a facet of the frontier when you talk about Mahbub Ali.
Yeah.
He comes across as a heroic figure in Kim. David, you find this contradiction quite apparent? And as far as something more, he described sort of Indian nationalism as sort of Brahmani plus Balial. Now, as a former Balial man, I wonder...
I feel like deeply insulting, of course. But yes, he always fulminated about the Congress, but I don't think he ever met a congressman. And I think actually he had kept the two sides of his head when he was in India, because when he was in his offices in Lahore writing for the Civil and Military Gazette, he could be quite critical. But certainly when he got out of it, as Charles said, when he came to Jaipur, and he very much admired the administration in Jaipur, he was much happier meeting the Indians here than he was meeting people like you, Swapan.
Yeah, but there is always that contradiction on every aspect of Kipling. You find contradiction, even with Bengalis. I mean, you have that poem called on Babu Haricharan Mukherjee, the pride of Beaubazar, and who gets sort of worsted by a Pathan or a turbulent Pathan who worsts him for daring to keep arms. And then you have in Kim a complete celebration of this rather rotund spy who through guile and deceit manages to ingratiate himself with the Russians. That too is a Mukherjee.
Yes. Yeah.
So there is that. So all along we find it, he celebrates the empire, but he's very, very critical about the social life, the tittle-tattle which accompanies life in Simla.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think that Kipling, I think Charles sort of said that he started out hating India. But I think that, I mean, one of the important facts to remember about Kipling was that he was born in Bombay, and this was a very sort of important, goes without saying, event in his life. He always remembered the sights, and the sounds, etc., of the heat of Bombay, his ayah, etc. He wrote about that in his memoir, Something of Myself. And then when he became a journalist on the Civil and Military Gazette, then he was a great observer, and this is the quality that comes out. He sort of played around in Lahore for a while. He was gradually allowed to go out and write a few things about he went to the Amritsar Fair. He wrote about that. Then he was allowed up to Shimla, and he liked to sort of see what was going on. He had a great critical faculty, and he was soon sending back his reports to the Civil and Military Gazette, and these were the stories that became the Plain Tales from the Hills, which is, I always say, the sort of point of entry, as far as I'm concerned, into Kipling's work. Very digestible, sort of 8 to 10 pages, little vignettes of life in India and sort of social satire about the Raj, something that had never happened. He took people to task. He talked about the corruption, the peccadilloes of the sort of high-ups in the Raj, and that was his quality. He was Charles said, he was a bit of a bolshi. Funny enough, I was actually quite astounded, but I was interested to discover a little thing when I was writing my biography of Kipling, that when he came out to India, he was actually a liberal. He was asked by, I think it was a member of his family, to fill in a form, which seemed to be sort of part of the thing that people did in those days. And he was asked about his favourite politician, and he put down Gladstone, which was kind of unusual. And it took him a little while. He remained. That was the quality. This came from having been at school at the United Services College in Devon, and there the headmaster, very sort of formative influence as far as he was concerned, was somebody called Crum Price, and he was sort of came from the background of the Pre-Raphaelites. He was a very sort of widely educated man, and Kipling. One of the interesting things about Kipling is that he had these sort of artistic, artistic background. His uncle was the painter Edward Burne-Jones, and this sort of remained an influence. When he came to Lahore, it took him a couple of years. Charles emphasized the fact that he sort of went out into India. He also went into the club, and it was in the club that he sort of, this liberalism gradually got sort of eked out of him, and he began to meet the engineers, particularly the administrators, the soldiers, and he began to identify with their mission, if you like to put it that way. Or perhaps even at that stage it wasn't really a mission. He began to identify with the way that they'd committed themselves to changing India, to the way that they had committed themselves to bringing water, changing various laws of suti, etc., etc. And this really impressed him. And this was the kind of origins of his love, let's use that word, of what the British administration was doing here, the origins of his imperialism. Because, yeah, he was an imperialist, and you can't get away from that.
He was an imperialist, yes, but he also had this strange admiration for all the noble savages, it were. If Ganga Din really epitomizes that, and some people would say You know, those who
That's
just
never
read
savage.
East is East and West is West and never the twain shall meet, and don't go into the rest of the poem, which actually says something about what happens when two very strong men collide.
Yeah.
But at the same time, if you go through Kim, that's a fascinating empathy, almost an absorption with Buddhism. And I think he
I
cried
think that's
almost,
later.
yes.
I think that's later when he's a much if I could pick up one point that we were talking about earlier, about the young Ruddy that I'm so keen on. As I said, he was an outsider. He's also a very timid little fellow. Let's understand the guy a bit more. He's dyspraxic. He's myopic. He's a runt. He goes to a school full of strong young men who are going to go off and be soldiers in India. And he admires those types that he can never be, the strong, silent men who are going to rule. He's never going to be one of those guys. When he comes out to Lahore, he sees that same, what you might call manly man, personified in the northwest frontier. These strong men who bestride the borders, both the administrators and indeed the Muslims. And he has huge respect for Muslim culture. And all through his life, he goes on to talk about Allah. He never talks about God, he talks about Allah. And you can argue that briefly he flirts with Islam because he sees it as a strong religion with strong laws. And the other aspect of Kipling, when he researches his subject, he's brilliant. When he fails to research and simply works on the basis of prejudice, he's a horrid man. And you see Orwell describes him as the gutter patriot. And that is the nasty side, the ignorant Kipling. And if I might, can I read you a tiny bit about Bengalis? I'm sure there are many people who are here from Bengal side. And he is never so unpleasant as when he writes about Bengalis, of whom he knows nothing. He knows nothing. And his apology to the Bengalis really is in Kim, when he's,
don't have to apologize
when he's
to
a
me.
wiser man. But listen to what the kind of unpleasantness he says here. And it's about, we might wait till doomsday, till the Bengalis educate their women. Meanwhile, the women are rotting in the zananas for sheer want of medical attendance. England, or wherever on it goes, thank goodness you haven't any notion of the horrors of enforced widowhood. The agitation is as old as the hills, but our progressive Aryan brother, the Oxford B.A. Bengali, will eat with you, ride with you, and talk to your wife, but won't dare to fly in the face of his custom. And he makes this business about women a very strong case. The other thing, I wouldn't use the word you called him the savage. It's the noble peasant. He has a great deal of time for the peasant of India. And indeed, there's a wonderful cameo. When Ruddy was 5½, he was up outside on the Bombay, I forget where it was now. And his parents see him walking off hand in hand with a riot, a peasant. And when they say, come on, Ruddy, time to go home. And he says, no, bye-bye, I'm staying with my brother. There's a little boy. And when the Queen's Jubilee comes up, is it 1887? He is expected to write a poem about the Great White Queen, and he does. But he says, the Great White Queen is not of interest to me. I'm the peasant. I'm the Indian peasant. All that matters to me is how I deal with the next harvest and the famine. And that identification with those outside the system. The British Tommy, for instance, who is also, Lady Curzon famously said, the two ugliest things in India are a water buffalo and the British ordinary soldier. There was this prejudice against the Tommy. He breaks that taboo about writing about not only the lower castes, like Tommies, but also sex. He writes about sex. He writes about sex between the races. He writes about sex between the British, adultery in the hills. Remember, down in the plains, picnics, duty and red tape, up in the hills, picnics and adultery. He's the first guy, and he's a very shocking young man. That's enough, I'm sorry. Enough on that.
So given the so many complexities about Kipling, between his sort of deep attachment to India and at times a visceral dislike of some Indians, in hindsight, looking back at it sort of 70 years after his death, and in the Indian context, should we view Kipling as yet another dead white male who should be relegated to the sort of dustbins?
What, in literary terms, or in
Well,
or as an
purely
imperial?
in terms as a historical record, as a creative writer, as a chronicler of India.
But when Kipling was here, we know he left at the age of 23. He accepted the Raj for what it was. It was a fact of life. I don't think he had a sense of imperial mission really until he'd left. And then it sort of dawned on him that in a world without the United Nations, without Oxfam, that there was a role for the richer nations in this world. They had a moral sense. I mean, when Kipling was in India, it was long after the East India Company conquests and annexations, and he thought they were here for a moral purpose. But he didn't really realize this until he'd left. And I thought I might quote from a notorious poem with a terrible title, The White Man's Burden, just one verse, because this has his philosophy. It's take up the white man's burden, the savage wars of peace, fill full the mouth of famine, and bid the sickness cease. And when your goal is nearest, the end of other sort, watch sloth and heathen folly, bring all your hope to naught. Now, Kipling was not a racist in the sense that he believed there was a biological difference in the races. But the sentiments here are, I think, are profoundly racist. But also, the sense is idealistic. He wanted the British here for a moral purpose to, though this actual poem was addressed to the Americans on the conquest of the Philippines. But he thought it was the duty of what later became known as the First World to help on questions of famine and disease. Now, rightly or wrongly, it was a very paternalist view, well out of fashion, and perhaps rightly so. But I don't think it was a particularly ignoble one.
If I may say something there, and it's interesting what you said about Kipling sort of realizing his mission after he left India. I mean, I tried to say that I think he began to find that while he was here. But in a way, you're right. The sort of the mission element of it came later. And I think that that was something to do with Kipling. He left India. He went back to England. He hated it there, and actually tried to sort of escape. He had what he called go fever, and he went to Australia, and then he came back to Lahore, and he was summoned from there with a telegram from London telling him that his great friend Wolcott Balestier had just died. He was an American publisher who was in London. And Kipling went back, and he very quickly, strangely quickly, married Wolcott Balestier's sister Caroline, and then went to live in the United States. And it was in the United States that he sort of begins to write his patriotic poems, The Seven Seas. He writes, he begins to get has a nostalgia for India, actually. It's in this period, while he's in America, that he writes the Jungle Book, begins to think about Kim to an extent. And then he comes back, and there's a sort of gap. Comes back to England in the late 1890s, and there's a sort of gap that's missing, and he discovers it in what is actually has developed by then, which is this sort of sense of imperial mission. And it's the time of the war coming up, and he identifies with this, and he becomes a friend of Cecil Rhodes. There's a sense that South Africa then becomes his kind of surrogate India in a kind of sense. He doesn't go back to India after that, which is kind of odd. I've never quite understood that, I have to say.
One of the astonishing things about Kipling is realizing just how popular he was in his times. I mean, he was almost a cult figure. And I think if you look at all the biographies of Kipling, one thing is very clear, that the importance which Kipling received from the reading public was not because of his imagined India, but because of his advocacy, a very populist advocacy of empire, of causes which, in hindsight, seems deeply unpopular, utterly incorrect, and perhaps even reprehensible. I mean, the poem If, for example, was crafted out from Jameson, the madman who triggered the Boer War. Everything. And I'm just struck that, how has he enlarged his vision from India? Was this a logical extension, or was this something which sort of suddenly hit him, given the bleakness of England?
But I think he spoke in tones that people, all sorts of people, understood, whether they're sailors in Newfoundland, or this poem, If, I mean, it was the favorite poem of so many people, from Woodrow Wilson, the President of the United States, the King of Siam, translated into Thai. The Spanish king had a framed copy by his bedside. I think that was one of the sort of things about Kipling, is that he seemed to articulate what so many different people secretly thought, and that is the secret of his popularity.
Yeah, and there were certain values which he stood for. I think, it's interesting that the Boy Scouts, or at least the Cubs at least, took their entire inspiration from Kipling. I mean, Baden-Powell was sort of indebted to Kipling for modeling it on certain parts, in a certain way. But at the same time, there was this sort of almost irrational anti-Germanism which came in. He even attributed a foot-and-mouth disease, an early outbreak of foot-and-mouth disease in England, to the fact that there had been certain German prisoners of war there who must have been feeding them sort of meat or sausages which they'd come from the parson.
Yes, but he did accurately predict the date of the First World War and of the Second World War.
Kipling loved to hate as well, didn't he? Kipling loved to hate. Kipling was a great hater. He had a horrible, he was brutalized as a boy. He was dumped at what he called the House of Desolation in Southsea. His parents literally walked out on him, and they weren't warned. They simply disappeared, and Kipling and his little sister Trix, who poor soul went mad in her later life from deep depressions. He became totally bipolar, and this is partly because of this horrible experience. And he writes himself, "I learned to hate that woman," he called her, and I think hate is a nasty aspect of Kipling. The German prisoner who is killed. I'm not very good on the later Kipling. So I can't comment, but I'm sure they will. This loving to hate. But I wonder if I could also say, I suspect there are people here whose schools have actually got on the walls If. I've certainly seen it at Ajmer College, and I've certainly seen it in English language school, I think somewhere in Bombay. And I suspect there are other places. Can I also make one personal thing? When I was at school, in an English class, we were asked to pick our favorite poem, and I picked Ganga Din. And my English teacher said, "Don't be a fool, Alan. I'm giving you detention." And I was put in detention for picking this poem. And he said after, "Don't you realize this is a racist poem? How dare you stand up and think you're going to read this rubbish from this man?" So there was this enormous anti-Kipling feeling in Britain, which we're trying to come to terms with still. But if you look at the poem, it's a deeply humane poem, which one foul-mouthed British soldier has huge admiration for this peasant who's gone round giving them water. The regimental beastie Ganga Din. "You're a better man than I am, Ganga Din."
There was also, apart from wanting to hate or loving to hate, there was a constant sense of betrayal which occupies Kipling's mind, especially towards the latter years. The betrayal of Ulster, the betrayal by the generals, the undeserving Getty. The Ulster poem, which is now sort of almost forgotten, I think really resonated in a particular audience at that time. It's quite striking. "Before an empire's eyes, the traitor claims his prize. What need for further lies? We are the sacrifice."
And the lies and those who died.
Exactly. And
you lied. What is it? Andrew will know that poem. What's that famous couplet?
Yeah, it's one of the.
So did he see his world crumbling before him?
Yes, I think from the Liberal election victory in January of 1905, when all the causes he felt were being betrayed, South Africa was being betrayed, Britain wasn't rearming enough to counter the German threat. And the whole rest of his life was a sense of betrayal, and he was becoming not just the Cassandra, but even the Jeremiah of warning that eventually warning it just before his death that he thought not only is the empire going to go, but actually Britain is going to go, and of course it jolly nearly did after in 1940.
Yeah, I just wanted to go back to something that you said. And when Kipling sort of came from India, he was going to be the great hope of English literature. The energy that he brought from India was going to revitalize rather sort of down at heel English letters. I mean, it was going sort of, the English literary scene was going through a stage where you'd had Dickens, you'd had George Eliot, and there was nothing really happening. Various people identified Kipling. Andrew Lang had read Kipling and saw what he was writing and said that this was the future of literature. This kind of energy that Kipling brought. This sort of infusion of India into English literature was a significant thing. Kipling tried to sort of come to terms with living in England, and tried to come to terms with the world of English letters, and tried to write a novel, The Light That Failed, which is one of the interesting sort of sub areas of Kipling. This novel that he wrote about an artist with failing vision. It's got sort of war connotations, takes in the Sudan war of a few years earlier. And, this, not really a great bit of literature. It didn't capture the imagination. And I think, Kipling's failure really to capitalize on that billing that he had as the future of literature, that sort of inspired him to go, abroad again and to try and find some inspiration. He was always on the move. And I think that was, perhaps one of the legacies of his upbringing, and then being sent back to England in that House of Desolation, etc. He was always looking for something to latch on to. And I talked earlier about, how he came to kind of have this almost romantic attachment to imperialism. David talked about idealistic, same sort of idea, really. It was a sort of idea, let's talk it, use that word, an idea that he wanted, that sort of did something for him personally. And then, yes, I suppose if you attach yourself in that way to an idea, and then you feel it's seeping away from you, you do feel that sense of betrayal, perhaps,
Yeah, I was just wondering, despite all these ideas about empire, at the end of the day, Kipling today is remembered not so much as the great propagandist of empire, but as a very significant poet, as a very significant writer. I think it was about a decade ago when the BBC did a poll of what the most favorite poems are in England, and I think at least two of them,
Yes, The Glory of the Garden.
The Glory of the Garden and If, came in the top 10. So, if I were to ask you, David, which is your favorite Kipling poem?
Oh, you can't say that.
Which one is it?
Well, there's the lovely one in the First World War, Gethsemane. I mean, the thing about Kipling, the extraordinary range of styles he used. I mean, somebody said that Kipling wrote with the whole language in a way that nobody else had done since Shakespeare. And I think you go through all his works and all his poems, at the end of it, you might think they've been written by 6 or 7 different writers. And the man who had the urgency of the Baroque and ballads, Tommy Atkins and all that, you can't believe that this man wrote lovely short stories at the end, like The Gardener, about a woman going looking for the grave of her illegitimate son. It's got nothing to do with empire, nothing to do with India, and it's a beautiful story by a very fine writer. And I think a lot of Nobel Prize winners in literature don't actually deserve the prize. Well, Winston Churchill, for example, but Kipling certainly did. And the woman sums up, there's a very interesting left-wing tradition of praise for Kipling that was inaugurated by George Orwell 60, 70 years ago, and continued with the late Edward Said, and also with Salman Rushdie. And they all have to say, oh gosh, his politics were awful. But once they detached him from that, once they got rid of the empire, they all agreed that he actually was a very great writer who expanded the boundaries of literature. And I think that is what Kipling now should be regarded as, not as an activism, whatever his ideas were, but actually seriously as a very, very fine writer.
You didn't mention the one about a woman is a woman, but a cigar is a
I know,
smoke.
that's awful. That's awful. and so is the scene of the species being deadlier than the male. That's a ghastly side of Kipling.
There was this sort of reaction to Kipling that Charles has referred to, his school experience. But that was a phenomenon of, let's say the 60s. I think that people have moved on from that now. There aren't those teachers in the schools who are sort of saying that Kipling is anathema. They probably don't actually know very much about Kipling. So actually, I find that there's a lot of younger students at universities who, I've come across, who are going back to Kipling and rediscovering him and enjoying him. And, I think also Kipling is being rediscovered by Indians and people who kind of come from what is called sort of post-colonial theory. They're discovering that Kipling has quite a lot to say. He is sort of described as liminal, which is one of those sort of modish words, which means that he's on the cusp of sort of the Raj, if you like, and a different world. And there are aspects of him that are very worth. I think. I mean, if I was studying 19th century India, I think that some of the things that Kipling wrote would be definitely part of my curriculum, if you like.
Charles, in your book, you've got a lovely paragraph where you list really all the phrases, the ideas of Kipling, which is endured in the English language. It would be really nice if you could sort of mention that or read.
Yes, my mind's gone completely blank. I mean, he is, I think, second after Shakespeare in terms of quotations. When we raise, little things that we think of as kind of sayings, they seem to be Kipling-esque terms, but the Kipling-esque word itself. Can I raise Kim? Andrew talked about The Light That Failed, that failed novel, which ironically he entitled The Light That Failed. For me, Kipling's light goes out, it gutters and dies, and then it burns briefly and little flares. And it's when he goes back to in great grief, when his daughter dies, and you can have no greater grief in life than the loss of one's child, and his beloved daughter Josephine dies, and he's in the throes of writing Kim, and that transforms his vision, and he suddenly becomes a much humbler man, and you see him remembering the India that he loved, and you can see him in the course of that novel, which sets out to be a kind of boy's own manly adventure story about spies protecting the great British Raj, and all these manly figures of Mahbub Ali striding, and Strickland Sahib, all laying down the law and controlling things, and it's that ordered life of the British Raj expressed by the railway. And then halfway through, the book completely changes pace. He leaves the ordered world of the British Raj, he leaves the railways, he goes onto the Grand Trunk Road, and he enters, which he says is the lifeblood of India. And he begins one of his chapters, quotes a Hindu proverb, "I go to the hills, I go to my mother." And suddenly you enter the disordered, instinctive life of Indian India. And I hate to use the word ageless India, but you might say Hindu India. And suddenly, from being a masculine novel, it becomes a feminine novel. And suddenly all the feminine aspects of motherhood and nurturing, the young boy from being a sort of Islamic Christian novel, it suddenly becomes a deeply, not Hindu, but Buddhist novel. And I want you to go back to that book and see it as a book about not just a boy's search for his identity. Am I Indian? Am I British? What am I? Am I Irish? Kim? What is Kim? Who is Kim? Who is Kim? But also, what is my spiritual life? And at the end, he has this choice. Am I going to look to the West, or am I going to look towards the instinctive spiritual life of India as personified by the Lama? Go back and see what his choice is. I think is constantly misdirected. It's a deeply spiritual and I think that novel deserves to be treasured and preserved, and I think it's his greatest work.
We talked about Kipling's two sides of his head, and there's a great quality of empathy in Kipling's work, which we've covered. Like David, I think it's difficult really to identify one particular poem because there is such a range, and he's sort of talked about some of the types of poem that Kipling wrote. But there's one poem that I often sort of like to come back to because it is humorous. There's a quality of humor in Kipling that is often underestimated. And this is a poem called We and They, which, if you don't mind, I'm just going to read because it's a fun little poem. Father, mother, and me, sister and auntie say, all the people like us are we, and everyone else is they. And they live over the sea, while we live over the way. But would you believe it, they look upon we as only a sort of they. We eat pork and beef with cow horn-handled knives. They who gobble their rice off a leaf are horrified out of their lives, while they who live up a tree and feast of grubs and clay, isn't it scandalous? Look upon we as simply a disgusting they. We shoot birds with a gun, they stick lions with spears. Their full dress is we dress up to our ears. They like their friends for tea, we like our friends to stay. And after all that, they look upon we as an utterly ignorant they. We eat kitcheny food, they have doors that latch. Sorry, we have doors that latch. They drink milk or blood under an open thatch. We have doctors to fee, they have wizards to pay. And impudent heathen, they look upon we as a quite impossible they. All good people agree, and all good people say, all nice people like us are we, and everyone else is they. But if you cross over the sea instead of over the way, you may end by, think of it, looking on we as only a sort of they. And that, it's Kipling. That sort of encompasses Kipling's way of sort of looking at things from a panoptic way or whatever.
Horrible man. He's just made Kipling into a multiculturalist. Well, I think, Kipling arouses so many different feelings in people. And I'm sure the audience has various questions. I see Shakti. Harsha, maybe first Shakti.
Thank you. My question is, Charles, both to you and to Swapan. You both discount the Bengali factor in Kipling's life. Well, Lahore and Punjab was full of these Bengali Babus, Raji Brahman, Christian were become, of biggish. They were biggish creations. They were not Tory creations. The Tories were content to leave India to sati, to widows, 5-year-old widows being dumped in Banaras and Vrindavan. So when Kipling was giving this visceral anti-Babu feeling, he was giving the same thing that said his love for the noble savage or the Raiyat of Maharashtra was stronger than what he thought was a disgust for this biggish creation in India, which is neither Indian nor obviously British. So how would you?
I think it's also worth remembering that Kipling is a paid hack. he was working for his newspaper. He was working for his boss, who happened to be my great-grandfather. And my great-grandfather was described by Alan Octavian Hume as, I quote, the worst sort of Englishman in India. My great-grandfather had been through the Indian Mutiny up here on Delhi Ridge. But in Jaipur. He'd survived by the skin of his teeth. And he had very, very strong views on Indian nationalism. Now, you'll remember that Banerjee and Hume, one of the earliest Congress meetings at the National Congress, was actually in Allahabad, where Rudyard Kipling was working and where my great-grandfather had his newspaper, The Pioneer. And so he was writing, he's a hack, he's writing to orders. And Alan is telling him, look, for God's sake, diss these guys. We don't want Congress to get powerful. So we actually have Kipling, who's actually saying, look, the only people who are fit to rule India, if it's not the British, are the Muslims. Because they know how to rule. The Hindus, they don't know. They're effeminate babus and so on. And this is, in a sense, he's the worst kind of Sun journalist, or Daily Mail journalist, can I say, at that time. And I don't forgive him for that. I think it was crude. Does that answer that question? I also think he's terrified of sex in some degree. And those of you, he comes out to Jaipur and he goes to Chittor. And here's this fantastic monument to Rajput glories and so on. And you will know the great satis and the sacrifices up there. He goes to the Gilmour. I don't know if you've been there. It's a cave. He goes into that cave, and you will see elements of E.M. Forster here, because E.M. Forster certainly got a lot of inspiration from this. He goes into this cave, and it's slimy and wet and dirty and dank, and there's a shivling in the middle of it. And he goes, ah, and runs out. And as he said, I slipped on the floor, which is like the oily, soft skin of a Bengali. Scary stuff.
It's also quite coincidental that Charles's great-grandfather's tomb in Kanpur has now been converted into a Shiv temple. Well, my personal favorite, as far as Kipling's anti-sort of nationalist views, is in 1935, at the time when the those passionate debates about the Government of India Act were going on, he made one comment, and he said, there is no point giving boys latch keys till they have a house with a door that locks. So I think that sums up. Harsha.
Okay, mine is just a reader's defense of Kipling. I've often wondered, because Kipling has created the most endearing characters, Mowgli, Rikki Tikki Tavi, if you read Baba Black Sheep, or even if, from whatever position it is, he's an author who kind of reaches out to you and stirs up your insides, so to speak. Why can't he escape the political debate around him? We are so, he's always bogged down by the baggage of history in that sense.
I can't answer.
David, since you've written the most political of the books.
At a certain level, I think he has, and I think when someone like Edward Said who was harsher on British rule than anyone in India, if he can actually disengage Kipling from the imperial context and point out all, as you say, these impressive figures, then I think that things will change. And they are changing. And Salman Rushdie did introduce one of his collections of short stories, and after a paragraph saying, oh, I can't forgive Kipling this, I can't forgive him that, but he is a great writer, and we must recognize that. And so I think that is a trend that will go on.
Andrew?
For some reason I didn't really hear very much what David said there. But yeah, and I think that you have to sort of understand that Kipling had sort of could compartmentalize, if you like, and there was the great, he had this great imagination that came into play when he was writing certain things. He was constrained or otherwise enhanced, if you like, by that sort of political side to things. If you look at his political poems, as I think we have kind of established, really, that they can be pretty awful, really. I mean, they're not great poetry, and when you you want to sort of read interesting Kipling stuff. You don't go to the political poetry. So somehow, he saw his political side as sort of part of his mission, and it sort of intruded into his work. There was that journalistic side of him. There was that desire to sort of portray the world around him. I've sort of come to end there.
Kipling, the paradox, I think, is extraordinary because Andrew, from reading Andrew's biography, you discover that he's asked by the Times to write a poem to celebrate Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee, and he agonizes over it, and he starts to write it, and then he stops it, and he writes another poem. And the two poems we're talking about are the recessional, God of our fathers, lest we forget, empires rise and fall. It's a very humbling poem about empire, it does not last, and captains and the kings depart. And at the same time, he's writing the white man's burden. We're bloody good at ruling the world. It's really paradoxical. It's quite scary sometimes, the two sides of his head.
And one thing that I'm going to throw out, and if anybody comes up with an answer to this, I'll be thrilled. While Kipling was in Lahore, he started writing this novel about an Irish woman who ran a brothel there, and there was sort of beginnings of the idea of Kim. It was called Mother Maturin, and somehow he was writing this. I think he sent a copy back to England, and it was going to be the seminal novel about living in India, the relationship between Indians and English people. There was this Irish madam of a brothel, and it's disappeared. And as I say, he called on it to an extent to write Kim. Clearly, from what we know of Mother Maturin, this was the basis for Kim, which became a much more complex novel, as Charles has so wonderfully described. But that is something that is missing. If it's there in the archives, which are just beginning to be opened out, how wonderful to discover that.
I think you had
Just shout.
Hi. Can I ask my question? Hi, I'm Rajiv. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, please, wherever you are.
Right.
Yeah.
Can I switch to a less controversial area, possibly? Like many Indians of my generation, I grew up on Enid Blyton and Billy Bunter, and lots of boarding school stories. And then later, I read Storky, and I thought this is probably the best boarding school story I've ever read. It's a pity Kipling didn't write more about Storky, but can you comment on Storky as the boarding school story of all time?
Not me. I didn't like
Not
it
me.
at all.
Yeah, it's funny actually that. Yeah, I've come to sort of appreciate it as a bit of writing. But when I first came to Kipling and I read these stories, I found them terribly arch. Sort of trying to be clever. There was the sort of the show-off side of Kipling, which has its point, and I think you begin to appreciate that. I mean, I think perhaps you're highly intelligent and a sort of evolved consciousness, and you were able to appreciate that. Somehow or other, it didn't do it for me. But there are for story. When you look back on them now, I find them a very fascinating portrayal of this bunch of friends growing up. I don't know whether you remember them.
I'm always struck by how nasty they are in terms of revenge. I see the hate, the Kipling the hater there, which I don't know whether you've been beaten at school, but whether it's a sort of revenge theme that I find unpleasant and childish. So I'm sorry, sir, about that one. But I hope perhaps somebody will stand up and praise Mowgli or something as well.
I think we can twin a few questions, and then we'll have one last round.
In line with the fear and the ridicule by the British before leaving, in particular Churchill, India has declined. And there's an argument by those who even knew Gandhi, who are still alive today, and even up to the youngsters, that we might have been better even today under the Raj. What might you have to say to that?
Some other questions. There's a session on the sunset on Empire. I think we'll reserve that for the sunset period.
Yes. So I just say what I was talking about Kipling's vision of empire. At that same stage was when Gandhi has recalled in his autobiography that he believed the British Empire existed for the welfare of the world. Well, he didn't believe that later on, but it was at the same time that Kipling was believing it too.
Precise and simple. I want to ask one question. So far as Rudyard Kipling, Jim Corbett, and E.M. Forster, whom do you consider the greater humanist in terms of personal relationship with me?
So
whom do you consider greater humanist? Jim Corbett, Rudyard Kipling?
Between Corbett,
right, that was
Foster,
the other one.
and Kipling, who had a greater humanistic relationship with India?
With India.
Well, I'm going to sort of jump in there. I think that we are all people who are associated with Kipling, and I would be very surprised if there was dissenting voice here. You're talking about humanistic response to India. I suppose it reflects my personal lack of deep knowledge of Forster and Corbett, but on the other hand, I would put forward a strong case for Kipling, being having the most sort of sympathetic, and I think that's what you mean, sort of humanistic attitude to India.
But Forster came out here after he'd written most of his novels, so it's completely unlike Kipling. And also Forster came out with a very anti-imperial agenda. I mean, he was a great friend of the Bloomsbury Group, Virginia Woolf, Lytton Strachey, people whose parents had been involved in the Raj, but who were actually very deeply anti-imperialist themselves. And also Forster came out really for friendship with India. He didn't like being in the club. He didn't like meeting the British out here. I think his portrait of India in A Passage to India is rather wonderful. Very sympathetic Indian characters. I don't think he had the same sympathy to the British characters in his book, and that's why it's sort of a flawed one. Paul Scott, I think, was. I don't think. Did you mention Paul Scott? Because there's another, I think, a very vital vision of the British-Indian connection at a particular moment.
I would
yeah.
Just very, very briefly, I would just remind you again that Kipling is a Victorian. E.M. Forster, Orwell, Edwardians, Scott, Georgian. They belong to different generations with different ethos. It's a Freudian world. It's a post-Lawrence world. All sorts of things have changed. The world has shifted and moved on. Kipling is left behind in his older age. And so I don't think you can compare, quite fair. That's all I think an Indian probably have a stronger views on this.
Absolutely the final question. Okay, the gentleman in the green sweater. Shout.
Run.
As Kipling thought that Hindus were incapable of ruling, or maybe they didn't have in their DNA to rule. And this question is to you, Swapan. You have been commenting on present day Indian political system. On this 64th Republic Day, do you think that Hindus have failed to rule, or they are too afraid to rule as Hindus?
It's a wonderful question, and I'm fully willing to engage with you. But I think this is really the inappropriate sort of venue for giving a rant on that subject. Really, I think we'll leave that for another day. I think we'll just keep in mind what Kipling had to think about it, and that obviously you disagree. I think we've sort of more or less come to the end of this thing. As a sort of final sort of parting shot, let me just say, there's a sort of wonderful Kipling story which I read, which is not there in, I don't know, the only Andrew's book, I haven't read Andrew's book because I couldn't get hold of it, but it's not there in most of it. When Kipling died in 1937, 36, he was given a grand funeral, and his cortege was taken to the Golders Green crematorium, and sort of the pallbearers being sort of field marshals and other medalled members of the aristocracy. And
not a single literary.
At that precise moment, there were the hordes of people at the cemetery who were mourning an Indian who had died. And he was Shapurji Saklatwala, the Tata Sons-sponsored communist MP from Battersea. He died. And so I think when Kipling's body was put into the crematorium, it wasn't accompanied by the sounds of Jerusalem. It was to this chant of the red flag. That's a delicious irony.
Yes.
Thank you very much. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Charles.
Can I read three?
Yeah, okay. Just a very, very last.
Forgive me. Kipling the poet. Can I read you 3 verses from a poem that moves me greatly? Because he is a great poet. In his grief, he wrote this poem, The Song of the Wise Children. He and his dad are sitting in rainy England, remembering the sunshine of Bombay, and he writes about remembering his childhood. And perhaps this will touch a chord with you as it does with me as a child of India myself. We shall go back to the boatless doors, to the life unaltered our childhood knew, to the naked feet on the cool dark floors, and the high-ceilinged rooms where the trade blows through. He's remembering his Bombay childhood. To the trumpet flowers, and the moon beyond, and the tree toad's chorus drowning all, and the lisp of the split banana frond that talked us to sleep when we were small. The wayside magic, the threshold spells, shall soon undo what the North has done. By North he means Britain, living in Britain. Because of the sights and the sounds and the smells that ran with our youth in the eye of the sun. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for covering the ground.
Thank you all so much. Thank you, Swapan, for leading this. And I stand corrected. Kipling is actually a verb. He was and is a work in progress. So back for our next session, India, an unbound breakout nation in spite of the gods, with Ruchi Sharma, Edward Luce, and Gurcharan Das. On the other stages, Google Mughal Tent has notes and notations writing about music. Baitak has Shah Abdul Latif. The Councilage Darbar Hall has Ghosts of Empire, and Samvad has a young adults workshop. So please see you back here in 10 minutes for the next session. Thank you. And please note that the authors will be signing books in the book signing area.